At this time, I would like to take a moment and recognize former State Senator Margaret Carter. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize Multnomah County Commissioner Loretta Smith. And I know we have a couple of legislators running down I-5 right now and trying to make it. I don't see them yet, and my apologies if I've missed any other elected officials. I would love to, at this time, introduce the regional president for Portland Community College, Mr. Algie Gatewood. Please come up to the stadium.
Good evening. Gatewood is not the easiest name to remember. Joanne, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here this evening and doing the great work that you are doing. My name is Algie Gatewood, as just mentioned, and I'm not really the regional president. I'm the Cascade Campus president, and very proud to be in that position. Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to have the honor to welcome you tonight to this event. And, you know, it's not every day that I get to welcome people to a church, and so welcome to Emmanuel Temple Church. But before I really get started, and it won't be long, I'd like to take a moment to thank Emmanuel Temple Church and Bishop C.T. Wells for allowing us to be here this evening. Now, I see a lot of friends and colleagues and very important people, which includes everybody in the room here tonight. And I'm tempted to try to recognize each of you by name. But I'm going to do something my mother said, and that is don't do that. But just know that we are pleased that you're here. I would like to thank the organizers for this evening's event, and Rachel Black Elk, Kendi Essery. And Kendi Essery she's our student leadership coordinator, and she's really one of the main reasons that we are here this evening. So I really appreciate the work that Kendi Essery is doing. Michelle Garcia, Joanne Hardesty, Daniel Smith, who was a member of the panel, and Jane Zunkel. Thank you so much for putting this event together. Now, there's a supporting cast that helped to put this on as well, and I'd like to recognize the people from PCC, Ricky Franks, Max Macier, Denise Peterson, who is a member of this church, and from the First Unitarian Church, Kate Lohr and Katie Raditz, and I also should mention A. Proctor from my office. And lastly, many thanks to the individuals and groups from PCC for their financial support. This really makes a difference. Dr. Rhea Combs, Kendi Essery, Dr. Claire Oliveris, the associated students from Portland Community College, and the regional district president, Dr. Preston Pulliam. Let's give them all a round of applause. You know, despite the progress made during my lifetime, we're still a long ways from achieving full equality in our society. Right now, in 2013, there are more black men in prison than in college. Think about that for a minute. More black men in prison than in college. That is exactly 180 degrees opposite from what our priorities should be in this nation. If we spend as much money on educating black men as we do on locking them up, we would be so much closer to realizing true equality in America. Now, the United States of America has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. That's not just of black people or black men. That's of all people. African American men make up only 6.7% of our population at large, but account for 40.1%. That's 40.1% of the male prison population. That's about 1 in 15 out of every 15 black men in prison. You know, if you look around in the audience and kind of count yourself off, 15, 15, 15, you get a sense of what this really means. And this is an ongoing tragedy, and it should be on the minds of every citizen from sea to shining sea. And that's why I'm so proud that we have some lawmakers here tonight, some elected officials, because you can help make a difference. That's also why I am absolutely thrilled to bring to you tonight one of America's foremost scholars in race relations, Dr. Michelle Alexander. Dr. Alexander is the author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. She's doing more, I think, than just about anybody in this nation to bring attention to this deplorable state of affairs. And now to tell you more about Dr. Alexander, it is my honor to bring forward at this time Rachel Black Elk. Rachel is a student on my campus, Cascade campus. She is a psychology major. She is the coordinator of the United Nations Club at the campus, and she plans one day to work in the mental health field in the Native American community. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ms. Rachel Black Elk, and thanks again for being here this evening.
Good evening. All right, so we have one house cleaning matter that we need to get taken care of. So we have 3x5 cards that we'll be sending around in baskets with pencils. That's where you can start writing your questions for Dr. Michelle Alexander, and then just send them to the end of your row, and our student volunteers in the red T-shirts will come and pick them up. Then they'll sort through them, and then questions will be chosen to ask Michelle Alexander. So, speaking of Michelle Alexander, she is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar who currently holds a joint appointment at the Curran Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicities and the Moritz College of Law and the Ohio State University. Prior to joining the Curran Institute, Professor Alexander was an associate professor of law at Stanford School of Law, where she directed the civil rights clinics. In 2005, she won the Soros Justice Fellowship, which supported the writing of her first book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. The book is considered one of the top African American books of 2010, and it won the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work for Nonfiction. The book has been featured on national radio and television media outlets, including NPR, the Bill Moyers Journal, C-SPAN, Washington Journal, among others. Alexander's current work reflects lessons learned in her previous career as a civil rights lawyer and advocate for both the private and nonprofit sectors. For several years, Professor Alexander served as the director for the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU of Northern California, where she helped to lead a national campaign against racial profiling by law enforcement. While an associate at Saperstein, Goldstein, Demchak, and Baller, she specialized in plaintiff-side class action lawsuits alleging race and gender discrimination. Professor Alexander is a graduate of Stanford Law School and Vanderbilt University. Following law school, she She clerked for the Justice Harry A. Blackmun of the United States Supreme Court and for Chief Justice Abner Mikva of the United States Courts of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. This book is humbling in so many ways, and the most humbling aspect is that the book reminds us how to be a human being, and then try to remember how to treat our human brothers and our human sisters. This book inspires this conversation and this action. So without further ado, it's a great honor to introduce Michelle Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for that very, very warm welcome. It is so good to be here. I want to thank everyone who helped to make this event possible and for all of you turning out tonight. It is wonderful to be surrounded by so many people dedicated to having meaningful conversation about this system of mass incarceration, a system that has decimated so many of our communities, destroyed so many of our families, and literally turned back the clock on racial progress in the United States. We live in confusing times today. It's a time of great paradox. You flip on the news, you flip on the television, and there is President Barack Obama, our nation's first black president, standing in the Rose Garden, looking handsome, dignified, and in charge. You turn the channel, and there's Michelle Obama, digging a garden in the backyard of the White House, not as a slave or a maid or as a servant, but as the First Lady, schooling our nation on better health and how to be good stewards of our planet. And then you flip the channel again, and there's the whole Obama family descending the stairs from Air Force One, waving to the crowd, cheered by America, cheered by the world. But then you drive a few blocks from the White House, and you find the other America. You wonder what wrong turn you made and how you managed to miss that promised land with all your might. A vast new racial undercast now exists in America, but you won't hear about it on the evening news. Obama won't mention it. The Tea Party won't mention it. Media pundits would rather talk about anything else. The members of the undercast now live in literal cages, often removed from our communities hundreds of miles away. The members of the undercast are often locked in ghettoized communities on the other side of town, often invisible to those who have decent jobs, live in good neighborhoods, and zoom around on freeways past the virtual and literal prisons in which they live. They're part of the other America. And it is another America that far too many of us have been asleep to for far too long. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. once said, quote, "There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution," end quote. And he was talking at that time about a profound moral revolution that was underway in this country, a struggle for the dignity and humanity of all humankind, a struggle to end what was then America's latest caste system known as Jim Crow. And just months before his death, he told an audience the story of Rip Van Winkle, who famously fell asleep for 20 years. When Rip began his extended nap, there was a sign posted on the wall of a nearby inn that had a picture of King George III emblazoned on it. But when Rip woke up 2 decades later, the sign had a picture of George Washington on it. And Dr. King noted that the most striking fact about Rip Van Winkle wasn't that he had slept for 20 years, but that he had slept through a revolution. He said, quote, "There are all too many people who, in periods of great social change, failed to achieve the new mental outlooks that the new situation demands." I believe his words are as relevant today as they were back then. Many of us, myself included, slept through a revolution, actually a counter-revolution. A counter-revolution that has blown back so much of the progress that Dr. King and countless others risked their lives for and some died for. This counter-revolution has occurred with barely a whimper of protest, even as millions of people, millions, have been rounded up, locked in cages, and then stripped of the very civil and human rights that Dr. King and so many others gave their lives for. In the years since Dr. King's death, a vast new system of racial and social control has emerged, one that certainly would have Dr. King turning in his grave today. We are now on the eve of celebrating Dr. King's birthday. And I think it's apt at a time like this to reflect on how much has really changed. You ask most people and they'll say, well, so much has changed. So much. We're free now to sit at any lunch counter, eat at any restaurant. Just look at the black lawyers and black doctors. Just look at Barack Obama. Just look at Oprah Winfrey and Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell, and the list goes on and on. Look at how far we've come. And then there's always the pause. But, of course, we still have a long way to go. And this kind of talk and that familiar line implies that we're on the right path, that if we just keep plodding along, sooner or later we're going to get to that promised land. But is that right? Are we truly on the right path, the same path that Dr. King and so many others were traveling not that long ago? Or could it be that we have taken a dramatic U-turn? Could it be that we are headed right back in so many ways to where we began? What would Dr. King have to say about mass incarceration in the United States if he were alive today? Mass incarceration has emerged as a new caste system, one that shuttles impoverished, typically poor black and brown children from decrepit, underfunded schools to brand new high-tech prisons. It is a system that locks poor people, overwhelmingly poor people of color, into a permanent second-class status, nearly as effectively as earlier systems of racial and social control once did. It is, in my view, the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, I'm always eager to admit that there was a time when I rejected this kind of talk. I was one of those people who resisted comparisons between mass incarceration and slavery or mass incarceration and Jim Crow, believing that those kinds of claims and those kinds of comparisons were exaggerations, were distortions. In fact, there was a time when I thought that people who made those kinds of claims and those kinds of comparisons were actually doing more harm than good to efforts to reform our criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. But what a difference a decade makes. For after years of working as a civil rights lawyer and advocate, representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality, and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and attempting to assist people who had been released from prison re-enter into a society that had never shown much use for them in the first place, I had a series of experiences that began what I now call my awakening. I began to awaken to a racial reality that is just so obvious to me now that what seems odd, what seems nearly embarrassing in retrospect, is that I had managed to be blind to it for so long. As I write in the introduction to my book, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. But I didn't get to this place. I didn't get to this place overnight. And it is for that reason that I can be generous and patient with those who aren't there yet. It took me a while. There were a number of experiences that finally began to open my eyes. And one in particular had a profound impact on me. It involved a young African-American man. He was about 19 years old, and he walked into my office one day and forever changed not only the way I viewed our criminal justice system, but how I viewed myself as a civil rights lawyer and advocate. At the time, I was directing the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU in California, and we had just launched a major campaign against racial profiling by the police. We called it our DWB campaign, or Driving While Black or Brown campaign. And we had already sued the California Highway Patrol for racial profiling in their drug interdiction practices, but we were looking to sue some other police departments in California as well, about which we had received complaints of discriminatory practices and tactics. And so we had set up a hotline number for people to call if they believed they had been stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race. And we put this hotline number up on billboards in Oakland and San Jose and communities of color around the state, urging people to call the hotline if they believed they had been stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race. And in fact, within the first few minutes, we had announced our hotline number on the evening news. We received thousands of calls. And our system crashed temporarily. We had to expand our capacity to deal with the volume of calls we were receiving. And so I was spending my day interviewing one young black or brown man after another who had been stopped, searched, frisked, sometimes brutalized for no apparent reason other than race. And it was getting late in the afternoon, and I was getting tired. I'd done a lot of interviews already, and this young man walks in with a stack of papers about this thick. He had taken detailed notes of his encounters with the police over about a 9-month period of time in his neighborhood in Oakland. He had been experiencing a series of stops and frisks and searches in his neighborhood, and he had been taking notes about each and every one of them. He had descriptions of every encounter, the date, the time, names of officers, in some cases even badge numbers. He had names, addresses, phone numbers for witnesses, people who were there and who could corroborate his story. Just an unbelievable amount of detail and documentation. And the stories he was telling me were corroborated by the other stories I had heard coming out of his neighborhood. So I started to think, maybe he's the one. Maybe he's the one we've been waiting for, the one who could be our named plaintiff in the class action suit we're planning to file against the Oakland Police Department. And to make matters even better, he was a good-looking young man. He was good-looking. He was charismatic. He was well-spoken. I thought, he'll do great on TV. This will work. So I was getting excited, asking him more questions, and then he said something that made me pause. And I said, well, wait a minute, what did you just say? Did you just say you're a felon, a drug felon? We'd been screening people with prior criminal records. When they would call our hotline number, we would send out a form to them to fill out, asking them a bunch of questions about their experiences with the police, and one of them was, have you ever been convicted of a felony? We knew that we could not represent someone as a named plaintiff in a class action racial profiling case who had a felony record, because if we did, law enforcement and the media would be all over us saying, well, of course we should be keeping our eye on him. He's a felon, the drug felon, doing our job. That's who we should be targeting, the criminals. And we knew that we couldn't put him on the stand as our named plaintiff without him being cross-examined for an hour in front of the jury about his prior criminal history, thus deflecting attention away from the law enforcement conduct and turning the case into a trial about this young man's criminal past. So we've been screening people with prior criminal records, and this one had not checked the metaphorical box. And so I was looking at him saying, are you a felon? Are you a drug felon? And he gets quiet for a long while and is just staring down at the table. And then finally he looks up and looks me right in the eye and he says, yeah, I'm a felon, I'm a drug felon, but let me tell you what happened to me. Let me tell you what happened. The police planted drugs on me and they beat up me and my friend, and he starts telling me this big, long story about how he was framed and the police set him up and dope was planted on him, and I just said, I am sorry, but I cannot represent you if you have a felony record. I tried to explain why that was the case. He kept giving me more information. Now he's giving me the names of those officers, details about what happened in those cases. And I am sorry. I cannot represent you. He keeps insisting that he's innocent. He says, I just took the plea because I couldn't stand the idea of going to prison. They told me if I just took the plea, I could just walk out of there. I'd have just felony probation. But if I took this thing to trial, if I tried to fight this thing, I would do years, maybe even decades behind bars. And I couldn't do it. I just took the plea, but I'm innocent. I'm telling you, innocent. I said, I'm sorry. I cannot represent you. And then he becomes enraged. And he says to me, you're no better than the police. You're no better than the police. The minute I tell you I'm a felon, you just stop listening. Can't even hear what I have to say. He says, what's to become of me? What's to become of me? I can't get a job anywhere because of my felony record. Anywhere. So I got no place to sleep at night. I can't even get into public housing because of my drug felony. He says, I have to sleep in my grandma's basement at night because nowhere else will take me in. So how am I supposed to feed myself? I can't even get food stamps because of my drug felony. I'm banned from food stamps. How am I supposed to feed myself? How am I supposed to take care of myself as a man? He says, good luck finding one young black man in my neighborhood they haven't gotten to yet. They've gotten to us all already. And with that, he snatches all those papers, all those notes up, and just starts ripping them up, the tiny little pieces, throwing them in the air. There's just snow and white paper in my office, and he walks out yelling at me, can't believe I trusted you. You're no better than the police. Takes off. Well, several months after that, I was doing public access television, doing a public access TV show that was broadcasting live out of his neighborhood. I was doing public access TV because we were trying to organize several thousand people to attend a major protest against racial profiling by the police at the state capitol, and we had been holding town hall meetings up and down the state, and it was a few days before the demonstration, and so I was doing public access TV trying to tell people, get on the bus, get on the buses and go to the state capitol. And it was broadcasting live out of a small studio in his neighborhood. The minute that show goes off the air, he comes bursting into the studio, carrying this dirty potted plant. He comes rushing up to me, and he's emotional, practically on the verge of tears. He comes rushing up to me with this plant, and he says, "I'm just here to tell you I'm sorry. Sorry for how I treated you. I've been watching you on the news. I've been seeing you out there trying to fight for our people, trying to do the right thing, and I shouldn't have treated you like that. He said, I would have bought you some flowers. I still don't have any money. I snatched this plant off my grandma's front porch. Here. Just thrust it into my arms." And then he turns around and takes off. I go chasing after him. He's just running out of the building. I'm chasing after him. He jumps into this broke-down car and disappears. Several months after that, I'm in my office reading the newspaper. Open up, front page. What's on the front page? Oakland Riders police scandal is broken. Turns out that a gang of police officers, otherwise known as a drug task force, had been planting drugs on suspects, beating folks up in his neighborhood. And who's identified as one of the main officers charged with planting drugs and beating folks up? Officer, he identified to me as having planted drugs on him and beat up he and his friend. And it was really only then that the light bulb finally started to go on for me. And I realized, he's right about me. I am no better than the police. The minute he told me he was a felon, I just stopped listening. I couldn't even hear what he had to say. And that was the beginning of me asking myself some hard questions about myself as a civil rights lawyer and advocate. How am I actually replicating the very forms of discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion I'm supposedly fighting against? And I also started asking myself some questions about this system. Why is it that we haven't been able to find one young black man in his neighborhood they haven't gotten to yet? What is really going on? That was the beginning of me doing a tremendous amount of research, asking myself and others a lot of hard questions, and listening more carefully to the stories of those cycling in and out of our prison system. And what I learned in that process was that my great crime wasn't in refusing to represent an innocent man. My great crime was in imagining that there was some path to racial justice that did not include those we view as guilty. There is no path that does not include them. Here are some of the facts I uncovered in the course of my research that I describe in the book. There are more African American adults under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. As of 2004, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, in many states, felon disenfranchisement laws accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. In some major urban areas today, more than half of working-age African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In some cities, and I don't know the stats for Portland, but in some cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia and Chicago, the numbers are far, far worse. Chicago, for example, it was reported that if you take into account prisoners, if you actually count prisoners as people, and you know, prisoners are excluded from poverty statistics, they're excluded from unemployment data, thus masking the severity of racial inequality in the United States. But if you actually count prisoners as people in the Chicago area, nearly 80% of working-age African-American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste, a group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I find that when I tell people today that I now believe that mass incarceration is a new caste system, a new Jim Crow, people react with shock, disbelief. They say, how can you say that? How can you say that? Our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. And if black folks would just stop running around committing so many crimes, they wouldn't have to worry about being locked up and then stripped of their basic civil and human rights. But therein lies the greatest myth about mass incarceration. Namely, that it's been driven by crime and crime rates. It's not true. It's not true. Our prison population quintupled in a 30-year period of time. Quintupled. We went from a prison population of about 300,000 in the mid-1970s, early 1980s, to now over 2 million people behind bars. As was mentioned earlier, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of even highly repressive regimes like Russia or China or Iran. But this is not simply because of crime or crime rates. During that same 30-year period of time when our prison population quintupled, crime rates fluctuated. Went up, went down, went back up again, went down again. And today, as bad as crime rates are in many parts of the country, crime rates nationally are at historical lows. But incarceration rates have consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime was going up or going down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what explains the sudden surge in incarceration, the birth of a penal system unprecedented in world history, if not crime and crime rates? Well, the answer is the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. Drug convictions alone, just drug convictions, accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal prison system and more than half of the increase in the state prison system between 1985 and 2000, the period of our prison system's most dramatic expansion. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. I mean, to get a sense of how large a contribution the drug war has made to mass incarceration, consider this. There are more people in prisons and jails today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. That's a fact. You don't have to raise your hand. But the enemy in this war has been racially defined. Not by accident, the drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color. Even though studies have consistently shown now for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. Or sell. Yeah. Now that defies our basic racial stereotypes about who a drug dealer is. You know, picture a drug dealer in your mind, and if you're like most Americans, you picture some black kid standing on the street corner with his pants sagging down. And plenty of drug dealing happens in the hood, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. It does. in fact, where significant differences in the data can be found, frequently suggests that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. But that is not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been one race, African American. Now, I find that many people, when they actually see the data, they see the numbers, they say, oh, that's a shame. That's a shame. But, we need a drug war in those communities. We need to get tough on them because that's where the violent offenders are. That's where the drug kingpins can be found. We need to get tough with them. In fact, in my experience, most people seem to imagine that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city communities and the related violence. In fact, for a long time, I believed that as well. But it's not true. It's not true. The current drug war was declared in 1982 by President Ronald Reagan at a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term, a war on drugs. But it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time he declared his drug war, drug crime was on the decline, not on the rise, and less than 3% of the American population even identified drugs as the nation's most pressing concern. So why declare a drug war, a war, when drug crime is actually on the decline and less than 3% of the American population is all that much concerned about drugs? Well, from the outset, the drug war had relatively little to do with genuine concern about drug addiction or drug abuse and had much to do with politics, racial politics. Numerous historians and political scientists have now documented that the war on drugs was part of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded, get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who are anxious about, threatened by, fearful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. Now, to be fair, I think we have to acknowledge that poor and working class whites really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. Wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools, give their kids all of the advantages that wealth has to offer. But poor and working class whites, many of whom were themselves struggling for survival, they were faced with a social demotion. It was their kids that might be bused across town to go to a school they believed was inferior. It was their kids and themselves who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for limited jobs with this whole new group of people they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And then to make matters worse from their perspective, affirmative action programs now created this perception that black folks were now leapfrogging over them on their way to fancy jobs in corporate America and Ivy League colleges and the halls of power. And this state of affairs created an enormous amount of fear, resentment, anxiety, but it also created an enormous political opportunity. Pollsters and political strategists found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them, a group not so subtly defined by race, could be enormously successful in persuading poor and working class whites to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. In fact, in the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, he described the strategy as, quote, the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to design a system that recognizes this while not appearing to, end quote. Well, they did. And a couple years after the drug war was declared, crack began to ravage inner city communities. And there were some in the African American community who found it to be just more than a little bit of a coincidence that crack would show up after rather than before a drug war was declared. But coincidence or not, the reality is that the Reagan administration seized on this development with some glee, actually hiring staff whose job it was to publicize inner-city crack babies, crack dealers, the so-called crack whores, and crack-related violence. Some of the people in this room are too young to remember, but there was a time when our television sets were saturated with images of crack babies, crack dealers, and so-called crack whores. And a wave of punitiveness washed over the United States as blackness and drug crime became conflated. And legislators began passing harsh mandatory minimum sentences for minor drug offenses, sentences harsher than murderers receive in many other Western democracies. And soon Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. And many black politicians, desperate to deal with real problems of crime and drug addiction and violence in their communities, joined the Get Tough chorus. Many of them had already learned that when black folks, poor black folks in particular, ask for good schools, they don't get them. When they ask for good jobs and economic investment, don't get that either. The only thing these communities maybe had a shot of getting were some more police and more prisons. Well, they got more than they bargained for. It was President Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible. And it was the Clinton administration that championed the laws banning drug offenders from federal financial aid for schooling upon release, banning drug offenders from public housing and people with criminal records from public housing so they couldn't even get access to housing upon release. It was the Clinton administration that championed the law banning drug offenders from food stamps for the rest of their lives. To a large extent, many of the rules, laws, policies, and practices that now constitute the basic architecture of this new caste system were championed by a Democratic administration desperate to win back those so-called white swing voters, the folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the civil rights movement. And so here we are. Still, I find that many people, even those who know this history, say, that's a shame. That's a shame, but we got to get tough on them, those violent offenders. What they don't realize is that this drug war has never been aimed primarily at ruling out the violent offenders or the drug kingpins. It hasn't. Federal funding in this war has flowed to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost the sheer numbers of drug arrests. It's been a numbers game. State and local law enforcement agencies have been rewarded in cash by the federal government for the sheer numbers of people swept into the system for drug offenses, which helps to explain why law enforcement often goes looking for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, frisking, searching as many people as possible to boost their numbers and keep the money flowing in. And to make matters worse, federal drug forfeiture laws allow state and local law enforcement agencies to keep, for their own use, up to 80% of the cash, cars, homes seized from suspected drug offenders. You don't have to be convicted, just suspected of a drug offense. And law enforcement can take your cash, can take your cars. And you're not even entitled to an attorney to fight and to get it back. Not unless you've been charged with a crime. So in this way, law enforcement has been given a direct monetary interest, not in ending drug abuse or drug addiction or even drug-related crime, but a direct monetary interest in the longevity of this war itself. And the results have been predictable. The overwhelming majority of people swept into the system have been nonviolent, relatively minor offenders. 4 out of 5 drug arrests, simple possession. Only 1 out of 5 for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or even significant selling activity. And in the 1990s, the Clinton years, the period of the greatest escalation of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug that has now been shown to be less harmful, less addictive than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent, in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. Yes. But by waging this drug war almost exclusively in the hood, we've managed to create a vast new racial undercaste in an astonishingly short period of time. But of course, being swept into the system is only the beginning for so many, because once you're swept in, you find that you are ushered into a parallel social universe in which the basic civil and human rights that others take for granted no longer apply to you. You may be denied the right to vote, depending on the state you're in, perhaps for the rest of your life. If you are a felon, you are deemed ineligible for jury service for the rest of your life. Many young men find themselves branded felons even before they're old enough to vote, before they're even old enough to be called for jury service, but then are banned for life from participating in our political system. For the rest of your life, employment discrimination is now legal against you. You must check that box on employment applications asking the dreaded question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? It doesn't matter if that felony happened a few weeks ago, a few months ago, or 45 years ago. Rest of your life checking that box, knowing full well that application's headed straight for the trash. Hundreds of professional licenses are off limits to people convicted of felonies. People say to me, oh, come on, you're making excuses for people. You make excuses. They could get a job at McDonald's. They could get a job at McDonald's. Getting a job at McDonald's is no easy feat. You've got a felony record. People say, well, come on, they could be an entrepreneur. They could start their own business or something. In my state, in Ohio, you can't even get a license to be a barber if you've been convicted of a felony. What are people expected to do? As I mentioned earlier, housing discrimination, perfectly legal. Private landlords, public housing projects, free to discriminate and do it routinely. Public benefits may be off limits to you. Financial aid for schooling, food stamps. Fortunately, many states have opted out of the federal ban on food stamps for drug offenders. But thousands of people still can't even get food stamps to survive because they were once caught with drugs. What do we expect folks to do? Yes. You're released from prison, can't get a job, can't get housing, even food might be off limits to you. Well, apparently what we expect them to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, and child support continues to accrue while you're in prison. And in a growing number of states, you're expected to pay back the cost of your imprisonment. And paying back all those fees, fine, court costs can be a condition of your probation or parole, whether or not you have a job. And then get this, let's say you're one of the lucky few who actually manages to get a job straight out of prison. Up to 100% of your wages can be garnished. Up to 100% to pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. What do we expect folks to do? What is the system designed to do? Designed to send them right back to prison, which is what, in fact, happens about 70% of the time. About 70% of those released from prison return within 3 years, and the majority of those who return in some states do so in a matter of months because the challenges associated with mere survival on the outside are so immense. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, my own view is that those of us in the civil rights community, those of us who think of themselves as working for social justice, we've got to admit that we've allowed a human rights nightmare to occur on our watch. We have. We have. While many of us have been fighting good battles, fighting to save affirmative action, fighting to hold on to the so-called gains of the past, millions of people have been rounded up, locked in cages, stripped of the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement. More than $1 trillion has been spent waging the drug war began. $1 trillion waging the drug war. We're constantly being told there's not enough money to pay good teachers. We don't have enough money for jobs programs for our youth in our community. We don't have money for job training or economic investment. We don't have money. Well, apparently we had $1 trillion to blow. And we spent it building prisons and hiring police and probation officers. We spent it creating this vast new system of racial and social control. So what do we do now? Well, my own view is that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America. Yeah. And if you're among those who doubt that such a movement is truly necessary today, surely something less will do. Something less. Consider this. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, early 80s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs, would need a new line of work. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities, communities that are often quite vulnerable economically. Many of these communities have been led to believe their entire economy depends on these prisons for jobs and economic growth. Those prisons across America would have to close down. Private prisons, now listed on the New York Stock Exchange and booming, doing quite well, even in a time of economic recession, those private prisons would be forced to go bankrupt. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure that it isn't going to just fade away. It isn't going to just downsize out of sight without a major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. Now, I know that there's many people today who will say, and who have told me, there is no hope for ending mass incarceration in America. Find another issue. There is no hope. I find that so many people view the millions cycling in and out of our prisons and jails as just an unfortunate but inalterable fact of American life. Well, I am quite confident that Dr. King, Ella Baker, Sojourner Truth, Ann Braden, and the countless others who risked their lives to end earlier systems of racial and social control would not be so easily deterred. No, they wouldn't. So we have got to be willing to pick up where they left off and do the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors. In 1968, Dr. King told advocates that the time had come to transition from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. That was back in 1968. The time had come. Meaningful equality, he said, could not be achieved through civil rights alone. Without basic human rights, the right to work, the right to quality education, the right to housing. Without basic human rights, he said, civil rights are an empty promise. So in honor of Dr. King, just days before we celebrate his birthday, and all those who labored to end the old Jim Crow, I hope we commit ourselves to building a human rights movement to end mass incarceration. Human rights movement. Yes. Yes. Let this be a movement for education, not incarceration. A movement for jobs, not jails. A movement to end all forms of discrimination against people released from prison, discrimination that denies them basic human rights to work, to shelter, to education, to food. So what must we do to build this movement? Well, first, I believe we've got to begin by telling the truth, the whole truth. We've got to be willing to admit out loud that we as a nation have managed to rebirth a caste-like system in this country. And we've got to be willing to tell this truth in our churches, in our places of worship, in our schools, in our community centers. We've got to be willing to tell this truth so that a great awakening can begin. Because unlike the old Jim Crow, there are no signs alerting you to the existence of this new caste system. Back in the old Jim Crow, there were the whites-only signs, leaving no room for doubt about what was going on. Well, this system doesn't come with signs. Prisons are hundreds of miles away, out of sight, out of mind. People cycle in and out of prisons from segregated, ghettoized communities to prison and back again, a closed circuit of perpetual marginality. If you are not directly impacted by this system, you can go your whole life and have no idea what is going on. So we have got to start telling the truth, pulling back the curtain, educating ourselves and others so that we can expose this system for what it is. As long as it remains hidden, as long as the myths prevail, the rationalizations, this system will continue to operate well for a very, very long time. But of course, just a lot of talk isn't going to be enough. We're going to have to be willing to get to work. And part of that work, I believe, is building an underground railroad for people returning home from prison. An underground railroad. We need another one. When people return home from prison, they need somewhere safe to go. A place where they know they will be welcomed with open hearts, with open arms. A place that will provide help in finding employment, finding shelter. A place where they can get food, but more than that, a place where they can feel love, feel human again. Now, unfortunately, many people who've been released from prison tell me their churches, their places of worship are the last place they would go. They say, church is a place where I feel most judged, most ashamed. I feel like I can't tell people where I've been or what's gone on with me. They won't understand. Many family members, mothers who have sons behind bars, daughters behind bars, say, I used to go to church and I don't go anymore. Worried about what people will think, what they'll say. Thank you. Thank you. And none of us should be. But far too many are. Because they don't feel safe in schools, don't feel safe admitting. Even those who've made it into colleges and universities say, I haven't told anybody here about where I've been. We've got to start creating safe places. Places that support families who have loved ones behind bars. Safe places for people returning home from prison. Building an underground railroad for all those who are making a genuine reach for true freedom, true liberation. Now, how do we create these safe spaces, safe communities? Well, first, I think we've got to begin by admitting our own criminality out loud. Our own criminality. Because the reality is we've all made mistakes. We've all sinned. We're all criminals. We're all criminals. I find very often people will nod and say, yeah, I've made mistakes. I'm a sinner. And then you say, you're a criminal. Don't call me a criminal. No, I'm not a criminal. I say, okay, well, maybe you never drank underage. Maybe you never experimented with drugs. But if the worst thing you've done in your whole life is speed 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you've put yourself and others at more risk of harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of their living room. That's the truth. That's the truth. But here in the United States, there are people serving life sentences for first-time drug offenses. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld life sentences for first-time drug offenses against an Eighth Amendment challenge that such a sentence was cruel and unusual punishment. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, it's not cruel and unusual in violation of our Constitution to sentence a young man to life behind bars for a first-time drug offense, even though virtually no other country in the world does such a thing. So perhaps rather than viewing criminals as them and not us, we should say, there but for the grace of God go I. All of us have made mistakes. All of us are criminals. President Barack Obama himself has admitted to using more than a little bit of marijuana and cocaine in his youth. But if he hadn't been raised by white grandparents in Hawaii, if he hadn't done most of his drug use on predominantly white college campuses and universities that are safe zones in this drug war, if he had been raised in the hood, the odds are good he would have been stopped, he would have been searched, he would have been frisked and caught, and far from being president of the United States today, he might not even have the right to vote, depending on the state he lives in. So rather than this being about us helping the criminals, or the criminals are them and not us, let us build a movement that recognizes this is about all of us, the liberation of all of us. All of us. But of course, just building an underground railroad and doing what we can to shuttle a few to freedom isn't going to be enough either. Because just as in the days of slavery, it wasn't enough to hide and shelter a few. It wasn't enough to build an underground railroad. You had to be willing to work for abolition. Today, we have got to be willing to work for the abolition of this system of mass incarceration as a whole. We've got to be willing to do it. And that means ending the drug war once and for all. Ending it. We're done. We've spent $1 trillion, destroyed millions of families, and yet rates of drug abuse and drug addiction remain largely unchanged. Most illegal drugs are cheaper and more readily available than ever before. What have we accomplished by waging this war? It is time to shift to a public health model for dealing with drug addiction and drug abuse. Investing in drug treatment and education. Stop turning poor people who use drugs into criminals and get them the help that they need and they deserve. But even that isn't going to be enough. We've got to end all these forms of legal discrimination that keep people trapped no matter what kind of law they have violated in their lives, trapped in a permanent second-class status. We've got to end all these forms of legal discrimination that deny people basic human rights. And last but not least, we have got to shift from a purely punitive approach to dealing with violence and violent crime in our communities to a more rehabilitative and restorative approach, one that takes seriously the interests of the victim, the offender, and the community as a whole. So we've got a lot of work to do. And it may seem like too much. It may seem overwhelming. It seems like we couldn't possibly do it all. But if you begin to believe that it's not possible, consider this. All of these rules, laws, policies, and practices that comprise the system of mass incarceration, they all rest upon one core belief. And it is the same core belief that sustained Jim Crow. It's the belief that some of us are not worthy of genuine care, compassion, and concern. And when we effectively challenge that core belief, this whole system begins to fall like dominoes. A multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement must be born, one that takes seriously the dignity and humanity of all people. And it's got to be multiracial and multi-ethnic. Because although this drug war may have been born with black folks in mind, it is a war that has destroyed the lives of people and communities of all colors. A white kid who's getting a prison sentence rather than the drug treatment he desperately needs but cannot afford is suffering because of a drug war declared with black folks in mind. And we see the same divisive, get-tough politics that birthed the drug war, leading to another prison building boom, this one aimed at suspected illegal immigrants. Yes. Happening again. So we have got to be willing to connect the dots and build a multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement on behalf of all of us. But before this movement can truly get underway, a great awakening is required. We have got to awaken from this colorblind slumber that we've been in to the realities of race in America. And we have got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals. Not necessarily all their behavior, but their humanness. For it has been the refusal and the failure to recognize the dignity and the humanity of all people that has been the sturdy foundation for every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, not just the war on drugs, but to end this history and cycle of caste in America. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, was that a mouthful or what? I am so appreciative that you have the ability to put in plain English what has been so clear to so many of us in our heart, the fact that you are able to say it in such a way that it is clear, it is concise, it is specific, and we thank you for that. Thank you, thank you. I tell you, but we have worked Michelle tonight, haven't we? And it is so wonderful. I want to give her an opportunity to take a couple of sips of water, why I take a moment to thank Deacon Jimmy Wilson, who, please come this way, sir, because without this gentleman, without Mr. Roger Wells, who's been doing the sound for us tonight, without Dr. Franklin Alvey and C.T. Wells, all from the church here at Emmanuel Temple. Oh, I know you can't be shy, sir. Come on. I just wanted to, in front of all these people, say thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's all I wanted you to. I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you.
And do you have a first question that you would like to ask? Would you like to ask Michelle Alexander our first question?
Well, if I did have a question, I would say, first of all, I'm this here securing lady here. You know, that's my first most priority. But anyway, if I have something to say, I would say to you, whether there are Amendment 13, Amendment 14, and Amendment 15 applies to this as a color or as a people in these days, in times.
Amen. I want to also take a minute to recognize some elected officials who are in our audience. I want to recognize Senator Jackie Dingfelder, Senator Mike Dembro, Multnomah County Commissioner Judy Shiprack, City Commissioner Steve Novick, and Circuit Court Judge Adrian Nelson. Thank you all for being here this evening. Okay, ready? And it is clear that you guys were listening carefully because these are some wonderful questions. And so I will start with this one. I hear us talking and looking back, but I think it's more important to reach back and march as Dr. King did. Do you believe black males should march against the new Jim Crow?
Yes. But let me also address the question about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and how that applies to our situation today, and also what the implications are for us moving forward. The 13th Amendment purports to abolish slavery in the United States, but there is an exception written into the 13th Amendment for those convicted of a crime, forced labor in prison. So interestingly enough, in the text of our Constitution itself, there's a loophole that more or less foreshadows what the next caste system might be, even as the amendment abolishes what was the caste system of its time. And then in the 15th Amendment, which abolished laws explicitly denying the right to vote on the basis of race, there is another exception. Exception for those duly convicted of a crime, of a felony, which has opened the door to felon disenfranchisement laws. And so yet again, you see that in our Constitution itself, as we take away with one hand, we create an opening for another kind of system and form of discrimination with another. And then the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection of our laws and was meant to strike down legal forms of discrimination and exclusion following slavery. Our U.S. Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, has ruled that it is not possible to challenge discriminatory application of the laws unless you can prove that they are enforced with discriminatory intent. So it doesn't matter how overwhelming the statistical disparities are. It doesn't matter how severe the racial disparities are, or the evidence of discrimination through statistical proof. It doesn't matter. unless you can offer proof of conscious intentional bias tantamount to an admission, you can't even state a claim for race discrimination in our criminal justice system today or any other aspect of our state and federal governments today. And so in this way, our system of mass incarceration and our systems of separate but equal education that persist, and many other forms of institutionalized and structural racism today are immune from challenge on the grounds that it is race-based, much in the same way that slavery and Jim Crow were once protected by our Supreme Court. Which brings me to where we go from here. And it has become abundantly clear to me as a civil rights lawyer that these battles are not going to be won in the courtroom. They will, in the end, have to be won in the streets. They will have to be won in the hearts and minds of each and every one of us. That's not to say there isn't an important role for lawyers. There is. They will probably be needed to get some of us out of jail. But beyond that, legal strategies are needed today. But when we talk about building a movement, this isn't going to be a movement that is ultimately won in the courtroom. It'll be a movement that is won in our communities and through the hard work of each and every one of us, locally in our own neighborhoods, but also collectively on a national level as well. A lot of times people will say, well, what should I do? What's the first priority? What should I run out and do next? And my own view is that it doesn't matter so much which issue you pick to get started on. What's more important is the way we do this work. And we have got to make clear, no matter if you're working on police abuse or banning the box on employment applications or you're working on felony disenfranchisement, we have got to make clear in everything we say and everything we do that we are not engaged here in piecemeal policy reform, that whatever it is that we're up to, whether it's challenging police abuse, it's because we are committed to dismantling this system as a whole. We've got to make it visible. And that might not be the politically safe thing to say, but it is the only answer we can give if what we want to do is actually build a movement to end the entire system of mass incarceration rather than just tinker with this machine along the margins.
So in your book, you mentioned that your husband disagrees with your theses. Can you say a few words about that and how your views differ?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
So in your book you mentioned.
Yeah. No wonder I listened to that part of the question. Well, two things. One, the gentleman who shouted out, people have to march. Yes. Well, I'll tell you, one person who would agree with you is Martin Luther King Jr. At the end of his life, I've actually been doing a fair amount of reading lately, preparing for MLK Day, which is around the corner, and I was reminded recently that we like to celebrate who Martin Luther King was in 1963 when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, and then forget about who he was 5 years later. And by 1968, Dr. King was telling reporters, was telling his staff, was telling his audiences that although he once believed in a little reform here and a little reform there, and in integrating this system as is, he had come to see that that was not the way to go. And I could read you the exact quotes. I got them in my briefcase there. But in a nutshell, he said that we have to be willing to build a true revolution on behalf of poor people of all colors. And he was planning at the end of his life another March on Washington. It was going to be part of the Poor People's Movement, the Poor People's Campaign. And this second March on Washington was not going to be characterized simply by speeches and singing. The goal of this second March on Washington was mass civil disobedience to shut down the federal government itself and make it inoperable. That's who he was in 1968, because after the Civil Rights Acts were passed, after they had won the Civil Rights Acts, he saw that white resistance to dealing with poverty in ghettoized communities, white resistance to dealing with the challenges of poverty and providing meaningful educational opportunities to poor kids of all colors were so great. There was such fierce resistance. Despite that the nation had just passed these civil rights laws granting civil rights, there was such fierce resistance to basic human rights that nothing short of massive civil disobedience would ever get the nation's attention and force politicians to deal with the level of change that was truly required. So I don't think it's an angry rant to say we have to shut the system down. I do think that when we talk about this and we build this movement, that we've got to speak beyond anger. That doesn't mean that we don't have anger, but we speak from a place beyond it. And that was one of the things that I find so remarkable about Dr. King's life, is that after being attacked from all sides, after being in and out of jail, after being turned against by civil rights allies who condemned him for speaking out on Vietnam, after everything, he still found a way to speak from love, from a place of love. And that, I believe, is our challenge. Our challenge. But I agree with you wholeheartedly on the tactics that may be required.
Why call your book The New Jim Crow when in reality it is American Apartheid?
Actually, that title was already taken. There's already a book with that title. It's a very good title.
Okay, that was the easy answer to that one. What are the top 3 things white folks can do to dismantle white supremacy on an individual and local level?
I didn't hear that, but... Well, I think actually many of the things that white folks can do are much the same as what black folks can do. They just happen to be in white communities as opposed to black communities. Part of it is about getting together and being honest about what is really going on. For white folks, it's first and foremost acknowledging your own privilege, your own blindness, and being willing to reckon with what has gone down and mustering the courage to speak up and speak out in settings and environments in which what you have to say will certainly be unpopular. So raising awareness, raising consciousness, and being willing to work as genuine partners with other people of all colors, I think is absolutely essential. What I've learned is that there is a lot of consciousness raising that needs to happen in the black community too. And that we may think we already know, but we don't always know what is really going on, and that there is a lot of shame and blaming going on within the black community. You go into a lot of black churches and you hear a lot of shaming. Not all churches, don't get me wrong. I'm saying there are a lot that come from a place of, why don't these young men pull up their pants and get their lives together and take responsibility for their children? We need to stand with them, but there is an underlining tone of blame and shame. And in black communities too, we have got to awaken to the reality of what has been done. And many black folks who are middle class and doing quite well in the system as it is don't really want to have to reckon with all those who have been left behind. So it isn't just a matter of white folks dealing with their privilege. There are some black folks with privilege that need to reckon with that reality as well, too. And I say, for my Latino brothers and sisters, we have got to stand in solidarity with one another. And we have got to see that the immigrant rights movement is our movement too. And those who are working in the immigrant rights movement are going to have to view the movement to end mass incarceration as their movement too. So it is about consciousness raising and the building of community among advocates and a commitment to a shared purpose, which isn't about each of us working for our individual issues and our individual causes, but building a broad-based movement that truly is about liberating all of us.
Unfortunately, I am sad that this will be the last question, but Michelle will be signing her books out in the foyer at the conclusion of the program. So the last question, your book ended with a note that it would take another book to talk about how we can bring about justice. What can you say about action now?
Well, I feel like I've done my best to address that question. Like I said, I don't feel that it is my position to offer a blueprint of action for any particular community. Every community needs to define for themselves what their first, second, and third priorities are and what tactics feel right and strategies that are appropriate. I think it's very, very important, though, that as we work towards movement building, that we do not fall into the traps of piecemeal policy reform. And those traps include saying what is politically expedient in order to achieve a short-term goal, while in the process sacrificing the long-term vision. And an example of this is movements and arguments to downsize prison because it'll save money. You hear arguments by well-intentioned advocates, we should downsize to save money, to save costs. I think we should downsize our prisons. I think we should end prisons as we know them as sites of dehumanization and torture rather than places of rehabilitation. But you'll never hear me arguing, we got to do this to save the state some money. I will argue only that we must do it because the future of our community depends on it, because the system as it functions is inhumane, because our race to incarcerate was fundamentally driven by racial biases and punitive impulses that are incompatible with the America we claim to believe in. Those are the reasons I want to downsize prison. You will not hear me saying, we'll do it to save some money. So I don't think that it's so much about picking the right issue and the right priorities. I think it's about coming together in your community with the people who share common vision and saying, what are we willing to do individually and collectively to build a movement, develop networks, and to challenge the system as it is and expose it for what it is, while building alliances with others who are working on related causes. I don't think there's any blueprint, but I think it's one of these situations where we make the road by walking it. And it is going to take a lot of work and an experimentation. And as Dr. King would say, just because you can't see the whole staircase doesn't mean you don't take the first step. Many of us know sitting right here what the next first step is for us. And whether it's consciousness raising in your church or in your school, whether it's going to your employer and finding out what are they doing to hire people with criminal records and felonies now, whatever it might be, you may have an idea of the first steps that can be taken along with others, and taking those first steps boldly and courageously, speaking your truth. I believe that the people in this room will be able to look back 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and say, yes, we were a part of the movement that began in Portland and began to spread. So I look forward to joining you in that work.